The picture you have of a medieval monastery is the one every history class built for you. Stone walls, candlelight, silence, a sense of order that the outside world could not touch. What history chose not to include was the single engineering problem that determined whether any of that survived the winter. The monks at Fountains Abbey in North Yorkshire did not hold their community together for more than 4 centuries of operating because of faith alone. They held it together because they solved a problem that your refrigerator handles for you without thinking. The moment that refrigerator stops, after a storm, after grid failure, after 3 days of power cuts, you have nothing behind it. Those monks had no refrigerator. They kept food edible and nutritious for 2 years. Not struggled to keep it fresh, kept it. At scale, through consecutive documented famines. Not with tools that cost money, not with imported materials, not with anything requiring a transaction with anyone else, with salt and with biology, with the same invisible process happening right now on every unwashed cabbage leaf in your kitchen. And the total cost? Nothing. This was not forgotten by accident. It was made inconvenient on purpose. The year that inconvenience became an industry, and the specific company that built a billing system around it, is less than a minute away. There is one specific decision those monks made that turned this from a temporary measure into something that outlasted the monastery itself. Not the vessel they chose, not the temperature they stored at. One decision. It is coming up. The story of how this knowledge left your household begins with Louis Pasteur and a word that was weaponized before it was fully understood. Pasteur published his germ theory in 1857. By the 1870s and 1880s, the popular press in America and Britain had reduced it to a single sentence. Fermentation involves microorganisms. Microorganisms cause disease. Therefore, fermentation is dangerous. That reasoning goes from almost right to exactly wrong in a single step. But it moved product in a way that changed what your great-grandparents believed. H.J. Heinz reorganized his food company in 1876 and spent the decade that followed building an empire on that cultural shift. His Pittsburgh factory processed millions of units of commercially preserved pickles, condiments, and sauces annually by the 1890s. The trade publication The National Provisioner, which began tracking the American commercial food industry in 1891, documented the explosive growth of the canning and commercial preservation sector through that decade. Shelf after shelf of commercially processed jars sold by an industry that needed you to believe the version you made yourself was the dangerous one. Home fermentation did not decline because anyone proved it was inferior. It declined because an industry needed it to seem inferior. The difference between those two things is the difference between science and marketing. You cannot invoice a crock of salted cabbage sitting in someone's cellar. You cannot sell a monthly supply of something a household makes once and uses for 2 years. The billing cycle simply did not have room for free. Not wrong. Inconvenient. Medieval kingdoms that ran intact fermentation cellars cannot be invoiced. That was the problem the industry needed to solve. And it solved it by burying the knowledge inside a cultural association with danger that most people never thought to question. But here's the part the commercial food industry hoped you would never ask. Exactly how the medieval system worked, how it kept communities alive through conditions that would end a modern household in 2 weeks. That is what comes next. This is not a new idea. The Roman army was preserving vegetables in brine before the first medieval monastery broke ground. But medieval Europe formalized this into something institutional, repeatable, and architectural. The Rule of St. Benedict, written in 516 CE, dedicates its entire 31st chapter to the position of the monastery's cellarer. Not the abbot, not the master of works, the cellarer. His function was singular and non-negotiable, ensure that what was stored in summer remained sufficient and edible the following spring. Chapter 31 of the Rule states that the cellarer must manage all goods of the monastery with care, without waste, and with the understanding that he bears responsibility for the material survival of the entire community. St. Benedict did not write that chapter because food storage was easy. He wrote it because food storage was the most consequential engineering challenge a monastery faced. If the cellarer miscalculated, the monastery died. Not struggled, died. Ibn al-Awwam, the Spanish Arab agronomist who compiled his agricultural treatise Kitab al-Filaha in Seville around 1180, devoted extensive sections to the preservation of vegetables and olives in salt brine. He documented the specific conditions required to maintain stored food across multiple seasons: underground storage, stable low temperature, adequate salt concentration, and protection from air exposure. He was not theorizing. He was recording what 3 generations of agricultural practice in the Iberian Peninsula had confirmed worked repeatedly under harsh conditions. His work moved through medieval Europe via the copying networks of Benedictine and Cistercian scriptoriums. The Tequinum Sanitatis, a 14th century health and household handbook derived from the earlier Arabic medical compendium of Ibn Butlan, cataloged foods alongside their preservation properties. documenting the role of salt and cool underground conditions in extending the storage life of vegetables and prepared foods across seasons. Surviving copies of the Tequinum Sanitatis exist in libraries in Vienna, Paris, and Rome. They were not theoretical documents. They were practical household manuals written for people who needed to eat in March what they had grown in September, what the monks at Fountains Abbey understood about the biology of food preservation, and what you're about to build for the price of a small bag of salt starts with one principle so simple it fits in a single sentence. English Heritage's published documentation of Fountains Abbey records the monastery's solarium, the long, vaulted underground storage hall built directly into the adjacent hillside, as one of the most completely preserved medieval storage structures in Northern Europe. That hall was not built for aesthetic effect. It was built because the geology and the physics of ground temperature gave the monks an environment the biology required. English Heritage notes the structure stretches roughly 300 feet and provided storage capacity to support a community of several hundred monks and lay brothers through extended periods of supply failure. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322, which historian William Chester Jordan documented in meticulous detail in his 1996 study, The Great Famine. Northern Europe, in the early 14th century, killed between 10 and 15% of the population of Northern Europe over 7 consecutive years of catastrophic harvest failure. Communities with functional fermentation and underground storage systems survived it at rates that neighboring lay communities without those systems did not match. Every single one of them solved this without paying anyone, without a bill, without a supplier, without a service contract. The biology has not changed by a single variable since St. Benedict codified it in 516 CE. It is sitting on every unwashed vegetable in your kitchen right now, and almost nobody's using it. You have seen this your whole life and just never connected the dots. When you bite into a dill pickle, you are tasting lactic acid. That acid is not an additive. It is produced by bacteria that were already living on the skin of that vegetable before it was ever harvested. Lactic acid bacteria, a family of microorganisms present on the surface of every raw cabbage leaf, every beet, every turnip, every carrot, consume the natural sugars in vegetables and produce lactic acid as a byproduct. That acid lowers the pH of the surrounding liquid. Think of pH like a dial running from safe to hostile. At the level lactic acid fermentation reaches, roughly the same acidity as orange juice, almost no pathogen capable of causing illness in a human being can survive. The environment becomes chemically uninhabitable for the organisms you do not want. Think of sourdough bread. The starter does not need you to add commercial yeast. Wild yeast already lives in the flour. You are not introducing anything foreign. You're giving the right organisms the conditions to take over and exclude everything else. Lactofermentation works the same way. Salt, pressed vegetable, thyme. The biology does the rest. The earth works like a cooler that runs on nothing. Dig 4 feet down in any temperate climate, and ground temperature stabilizes at roughly 50 degrees Fahrenheit all year. Cold enough to slow bacterial activity to almost nothing. Not cold enough to freeze the contents. That is a refrigerator that requires no electricity, no maintenance, and no monthly cost. The monks at Fountains Abbey did not discover this principle. They built a 300-foot stone hall around it. Most people who try this get one step wrong. It is the first step. And it is the difference between a crock that keeps for 2 years and one that turns soft and unpleasant before the first month ends. Here is what you need. Here is what you need. I want to be honest with you about every number. A wide-mouth ceramic crock or glass jar. A mason jar from any thrift store costs $1. A new ceramic fermentation crock costs between $10 and $20. A clean food-grade plastic bucket works. Anything non-reactive holds the process. Non-iodized salt, pickling salt, kosher salt, or unrefined sea salt without anti-caking additives. A standard bag from any grocery store. Under $2. Dense vegetables. Cabbage, carrots, turnips, beets, radishes. Grown from your own garden. Free. Bought at a market. $2 to $4 for several pounds. A weight that fits inside the mouth of your vessel. A smooth stone. A Ziploc bag filled with brine water. A smaller jar filled with water and set on top. A cloth or loosely fitting lid. That is genuinely it. The monks at Fountains Abbey worked with fired clay vessels and smooth river stones. You are working with tools they would have considered well-equipped. Most people who try this get one step wrong. It is the first step. And it is the difference between fermentation that holds for 2 years and fermentation that fails before the first month ends. Here's the one thing most people get wrong. They use iodized table salt. Iodine was added to common table salt beginning in the 1920s in the United States as a public health measure against iodine deficiency. That is its purpose, and it serves it well. The problem is that lactic acid bacteria are microorganisms. Iodized salt is formulated to suppress microorganisms. It suppresses the exact organisms the fermentation requires before the process can establish itself. The cabbage sits in salted liquid, neither fermenting nor properly preserved until it decays. Food writer and fermentation researcher Sandor Katz, in his 2012 work, The Art of Fermentation, documents the universal preference across traditional fermentation cultures worldwide for unrefined, non-iodized salt, a preference that predates any understanding of iodine chemistry and emerged purely from observing what worked across generations. Use pickling salt, use kosher salt, use sea salt without additives, check the label before you buy. Iodine listed anywhere in the ingredients, put it back on the shelf. Now, start with 1 medium head of green cabbage, roughly 2 pounds. Slice it thin, about the thickness of a coin. Work through the entire head except the core. Weigh what you have sliced. This step matters more than any other measurement in the process. For every pound of sliced cabbage, roughly the weight of a standard paperback book, measure out 1 level teaspoon of non-iodized salt. Not heaped, not rounded, level. This produces a 2% salt concentration by weight. That is the lower boundary at which lactic acid bacteria consistently and reliably outcompete spoilage organisms. Higher concentrations produce a saltier result and ferment more slowly. Lower concentrations are unreliable and not worth the risk. Add the measured salt directly to the sliced cabbage in a large bowl. Work it with both hands for 10 full minutes. Squeeze it, press it, pull it apart, and compress it again. What you are breaking are the individual cell walls of the cabbage, forcing out the water stored inside each one. Think of wringing a wet towel, except the towel generates its own liquid as you work. After 10 minutes of steady pressure, the bowl holds a noticeably collapsed, wilted mass of cabbage, sitting in a pool of its own liquid. That liquid is the brine. It is the medium in which the entire process occurs. It is the barrier that will protect the finished product for up to 2 years of cold storage. Taste a small piece at this point. It should read as pleasantly salty, like a well-seasoned broth. Not overwhelming, not bland. If it is unpleasantly salty, a small amount of additional cabbage worked in will bring the ratio down without ruining the batch. Pack the cabbage tightly into your vessel. Use your fist, drive it down in layers, compressing each before adding the next. You are removing air pockets and pushing brine up and over the cabbage with each press. The goal is to have the liquid level sitting above the surface of the packed cabbage by at least the height of your thumbnail. If it is not covering the surface, add a small amount of backup brine, and 1 level teaspoon of non-iodized salt dissolved in 1 cup of water, until the cabbage sits fully submerged. Place your weight on top of the packed cabbage. This is the step most people skip. It is the one that made the difference between a Cistercian solarium that held food through a full winter and one that failed by March. Any surface of vegetable exposed to air above the brine line will grow aerobic mold rather than lactic acid bacteria. The mold is not typically dangerous, but it destroys the texture and flavor of everything it contacts and spreads. A weight that holds the entire mass below the liquid surface eliminates this problem permanently. The monks at Fountains Abbey used smooth river stones cleaned before use. You can use a flat stone, a small jar filled with water, or a Ziploc bag filled with brine and pressed flat against the surface. Cover the mouth of the vessel with a cloth secured with a rubber band. Do not seal it airtight. Fermentation generates carbon dioxide as a continuous byproduct. A sealed container builds pressure. The cloth lets the gas escape while preventing insects. Set the vessel somewhere between 60 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit. A kitchen counter is fine. A basement shelf is fine. The next step is the one most people skip. It is also the one that made the difference between a solarium that supplied Fountains Abbey through 8 months of a northern English winter, and one that failed before spring. Within 24 to 48 hours, small bubbles will appear, rising slowly through the brine, one by one. That is carbon dioxide produced by lactic acid bacteria consuming sugar from the cabbage. The pH is already beginning to fall. The fermentation has started and will now defend itself. After 3 to 5 days of active bubbling at room temperature, move the vessel to cold storage, below 55 degrees Fahrenheit. A root cellar is ideal. An unheated basement in winter works. A standard refrigerator works. Cold does not stop the fermentation. It slows it to almost nothing. The lactic acid already produced remains in the brine and continues to protect the food. At this point, the pH of the brine sits around 3 to 3.5, the acidity of orange juice, and almost no organism capable of causing human illness can survive in that environment. Leave it. Check every 2 weeks. Push down anything that has floated above the brine line. Skim any white film from the surface if you see it. This is usually calm yeast, harmless but unpleasant in flavor, and it stays below the surface once removed. Keep the vegetables submerged. That is the entire ongoing requirement. At 2 weeks, the sauerkraut is edible. Mild, slightly tangy, fresh. At 3 months, the flavor has developed a complexity you will not find at any price point in a commercial product. At 6 months, it is sharper, deeper, and still nutritionally intact. Naval surgeon James Lind, in his 1747 Treatise of the Scurvy, documented that vitamin C is preserved in fermented vegetables through the lactic acid environment rather than destroyed by it, the same property that led Captain James Cook to carry barrels of sauerkraut on his Pacific voyages of the 1770s to prevent scurvy in his crew. At 12 to 18 months in consistent cold storage, vegetables maintained below the brine line throughout, the product is still safe, still edible, still nourishing. 2 years, without electricity, without refrigeration, without a single purchase after the initial salt. 1 jar does this for 1 person. What a family of 4 running 4 large crocks, each holding roughly 5 pounds of fermented vegetables, has is a year's supply of preserved produce from a single afternoon of autumn labor, running without ongoing cost through every week that follows. What the Cistercian monks at Fountains Abbey did with the same principle at full community scale, and what that means for your neighborhood today, changes how you think about the entire problem. At its operational peak in the 13th century, Fountains Abbey was not merely storing for its own monastic community. According to English Heritage's site documentation and the research of historian David Knowles, whose foundational study, The Monastic Order in England, examined the organizational systems of medieval English monasticism, the monastery maintained agricultural and storage infrastructure across multiple granges, distant farming estates managed by lay brothers, that collectively fed a community of several hundred people through years of consecutive supply failure. They did not react to famine. They had built the system years before the famine arrived. The system ran without anyone's permission, without any outside supply chain, and without a single invoice. No bills, no infrastructure beyond what they built once, no asking anyone's permission. Revol's Abbey, also in Yorkshire, and Tintern Abbey in Wales, both documented in English Heritage's site publications, operated on the same architectural principle: underground solarium, fermentation vessels, cold storage built into the hillside geometry. This was not unusual technology for a functioning medieval community. It was standard operating procedure for any institution that intended to survive. There is one condition where this works less well. Medieval engineers knew it, and the way they solved it is the last thing in this script. Lactofermentation in warm storage environments does not stop. Cold slows it. If your storage space never drops reliably below 65 degrees Fahrenheit through winter, the fermentation will continue past the point where most people find the result palatable. The acidity keeps rising. The texture continues to break down. The food remains safe but becomes increasingly difficult to eat beyond 12 to 14 months rather than holding stable for 2 years. The medieval solution was to dig. Earth temperature in temperate climates stabilizes at approximately 50 degrees Fahrenheit at a depth of 4 feet regardless of surface weather. The solarium at Fountains Abbey was built directly into the hillside, precisely because that temperature was what the biology needed and the hillside provided it for nothing. English Heritage describes the structure as one of the most complete surviving examples of medieval underground storage architecture in Northern Europe. The monks did not build it to impress visitors. They built it because the temperature inside it was an engineering specification. You do not need a vaulted stone hall. A hole 3 to 4 feet deep, lined with straw and covered with a board and a layer of soil, gives you the same physics at no cost. If you live in a warm climate, place a thermometer in the lowest point of an unheated basement and read it after 24 hours. Below 55 degrees through winter, you have a medieval solarium. Above 65, consistently, increase your salt ratio to slow fermentation and plan to use the product before the 14-month mark rather than holding it to 2 years. If the temperature is right, the biology does the rest without your involvement. The vaulted solarium at Fountains Abbey still stands. You can walk through it. English Heritage manages the site in North Yorkshire and has it open to visitors. The same ground temperature that moved through those stones in 1200 CE moves through them today. The same biology that those monks relied on to carry their community through the Great Famine of 1315 has not changed by a single mechanism. The monks are gone. The invoices they never paid are not owed. The industry that replaced their methods is still billing. The lactic acid bacteria are in your kitchen right now, waiting on the surface of every unwashed cabbage leaf you have ever bought. The process still works. The rule of St. Benedict described its requirements in 516 CE, and nothing about it has changed. What you build with a jar and a teaspoon of unrefined salt does exactly what the solarium at Fountains Abbey did. I do not know what brought you here. It does not matter. It works either way.